Something extraordinary is about to happen, and whether you have realized it consciously or not, there is a reason you found yourself here today. Every year, as one particular day approaches, countless people from completely different backgrounds, cultures, and spiritual paths begin turning their attention toward the very same moment. It is not a celebration recognized by governments, nor is it an event most classrooms ever discuss. Yet somehow, this date continues calling people back with a quiet magnetism that refuses to disappear. Today is August 7th, 2026. Tomorrow marks the opening of what millions now recognize as the Lion's Gate portal. If you have ever questioned why this single day inspires so much reverence across the world, or why so many individuals describe it as a turning point in their spiritual journey, you are about to discover the deeper story behind that fascination. Even more importantly, you will understand why generations of spiritual teachers and practitioners have repeatedly advised avoiding 7 specific behaviors during this window, believing that these choices can interfere with the very opportunity this sacred threshold is believed to provide. This is not about creating anxiety or convincing you to fear tomorrow. Instead, it is about approaching something ancient with humility and respect. The traditions connected to this moment reach so far into humanity's past that they extend well beyond recorded history, surviving through civilizations, changing languages, and evolving belief systems. Despite the modern world offering countless explanations for everything we experience, this particular date continues attracting people with remarkable consistency, as though something within us remembers its importance long before the mind can explain it. If part of you has been sensing that tomorrow carries unusual significance, trust that feeling and continue with me, because what follows may completely reshape the way you experience the hours ahead. Before we explore the guidance surrounding this remarkable day, let us begin with the question that has echoed through countless generations. Why has this date remained so meaningful for so many people? Although the phrase Lion's Gate portal has become widely recognized only within modern spiritual and metaphysical communities during recent decades, the celestial event inspiring this tradition has existed for thousands of years. Long before anyone used today's terminology, ancient civilizations were already paying extraordinary attention to the same annual occurrence. Among them, ancient Egypt stands as one of the clearest examples. During this period of the year, Egyptian observers carefully watched the heavens for the return of Sirius, the brightest star visible from Earth after our own sun. For several weeks each year, Sirius disappeared completely beneath the horizon, leaving the night sky without its familiar brilliance. Then, almost as though it were emerging from another realm, the star would appear again just before sunrise, rising in close relationship with the sun itself. Ancient Egyptians knew this moment as the rising of Sopdet, a celestial event deeply connected with the goddess Isis. For them, this was never simply another astronomical observation. The return of Sirius unfolded at nearly the same time as the yearly flooding of the Nile River, the event upon which their entire civilization depended. After months of dry and exhausted land, the floodwaters spread nutrient-rich silt across the fields, transforming landscapes that had seemed lifeless into fertile ground capable of sustaining another year of harvest. In practical terms, this yearly cycle represented the difference between survival and catastrophe. It meant the difference between abundance and famine. Because of that, the appearance of Sirius became inseparable from themes of renewal, resurrection, divine order, and perfectly timed transformation. Imagine what that experience must have felt like for those ancient communities. A brilliant star vanishes from the heavens, only to return at the precise moment life itself begins flowing back into the land. Over generations, this recurring pattern naturally shaped the way people understood existence. They saw not coincidence, but a sacred rhythm, reminding humanity that endings are rarely permanent, and that what disappears often prepares for an even more meaningful return. The symbolism became so influential that Egyptian priests incorporated this celestial alignment into religious practice, sacred architecture, and ceremonial life. Entire temples were designed with careful consideration of this annual event. Researchers have also pointed toward the Great Sphinx as one example of monumental architecture connected to important celestial alignments during this same period of the calendar. Some scholars studying the Giza Plateau have further suggested that certain structures may have been intentionally positioned not only in relation to the rising sun, but also toward the point along the horizon where Sirius would once again become visible following its seasonal disappearance. While archaeology continues examining the finer details of these theories, the broader historical picture remains remarkably consistent. Ancient Egypt devoted extraordinary amounts of planning, labor, engineering, and spiritual focus to this recurring astronomical event. Such commitment, sustained across centuries, suggests that this convergence held immense importance long before modern spirituality introduced the name Lion's Gate Portal. Yet, astronomy represents only one layer of why this date continues attracting attention. Another equally influential perspective comes through numerology, particularly the symbolism surrounding August 8th, commonly written as 88. Within numerological traditions, the number 8 possesses unique meaning, unlike nearly any other number. When viewed horizontally, its familiar shape becomes the mathematical symbol representing infinity, a continuous path without beginning or ending. Because of this visual relationship, 8 has long been interpreted as expressing the endless movement between the visible and invisible dimensions of existence, between spiritual awareness and physical reality, between personal effort and eventual reward. Rather than promising effortless success, the energy traditionally associated with 8 emphasizes balance, responsibility, and the natural exchange between what an individual contributes to life and what eventually returns through that contribution. When the number appears twice, once in the month and again in the day, many spiritual systems understand its influence as becoming amplified instead of merely duplicated. Within that framework, 88 is sometimes described as a moment when ordinary perceptions briefly become more receptive to something greater, a symbolic checkpoint, inviting reflection upon the deeper patterns shaping one's life. Numerologists also connect 8 with karma and the principle of cyclical balance. From this perspective, experiences eventually return not as arbitrary rewards or punishments, but as expressions of the natural equilibrium continuously unfolding throughout existence. This understanding gives August 8th an additional layer of significance. If 8 represents the ongoing relationship between action and consequence, then a date formed by 2 8s becomes an especially meaningful opportunity to examine which personal patterns deserve continued investment and which habits, beliefs, or emotional cycles are ready to be released. When the symbolic power of 88 is considered alongside the ancient appearance of Sirius and its life-affirming relationship with the Nile, the enduring influence of this date becomes easier to understand. Its importance was never built upon a single belief system. Instead, multiple traditions developed across different places and eras, each arriving independently at remarkably similar conclusions about this point in the yearly cycle. Egypt certainly was not alone in recognizing Sirius as extraordinary. Across West Africa, the Dogon people preserved highly detailed knowledge regarding the Sirius star system, information that later fascinated Western anthropologists because aspects of that knowledge appeared strikingly consistent with discoveries that modern science would not verify until telescopic observation advanced many centuries afterward. Far across the Pacific, Polynesian navigators relied upon Sirius as one of the essential celestial guides for navigating immense ocean distances. Indigenous societies throughout the Americas also integrated the star's annual appearance into seasonal cycles and ceremonial traditions. Meanwhile, in the ancient Greek and Roman worlds, Sirius became closely associated with the hottest period of the year, giving rise to the expression "dog days of summer" through its connection with the constellation Canis Major. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of all is not simply that civilizations separated by oceans observed the same star. It is that so many of them, developing independently and without direct contact, attached remarkably similar meanings to its return. Again and again, themes of renewal, rebirth, transition, and sacred timing emerged. That repeating pattern may explain why millions of people continue feeling drawn toward this date today, even though most rarely look upward to follow the annual movement of Sirius across the heavens. Whether that attraction has been passed forward through culture, inherited symbolism, or something more difficult to explain, the feeling itself remains surprisingly persistent. Even within ancient Egypt, the importance of this convergence extended well beyond agriculture. The reappearance of Sirius traditionally signaled the beginning of the Egyptian calendar year itself. In other words, this was not merely the arrival of another season. It represented the beginning of time as their civilization measured it. Every year, without exception, their understanding of renewal, continuity, and the unfolding of life itself was anchored to this exact celestial return, making this annual moment one of the most profound symbols of new beginnings in the ancient world. As we continue, that historical foundation becomes essential for understanding why so many spiritual traditions believe tomorrow deserves not only celebration, but also careful awareness of how we choose to move through it. If even a small portion of that ancient legacy has continued echoing through human consciousness across countless generations, whether people recognize its origins or not, it may help explain why this particular moment on the calendar continues to awaken such a powerful inner response. There is something remarkable about the way so many individuals feel an unexpected pull as this date approaches, even when they know very little about its historical or astronomical background. Over the last several decades, as spiritual communities became increasingly connected through books, workshops, online discussions, and eventually social media, the Lion's Gate gradually evolved beyond its earliest associations with Sirius and the traditions of ancient Egypt. While its historical foundation remained unchanged, modern spiritual teachings began expanding its meaning, describing this period as an unusually supportive window for inner transformation, conscious manifestation, emotional healing, and profound spiritual insight. It is important to approach these ideas with balance. They should not be accepted as unquestionable fact, nor should they be interpreted as fixed predictions about what every person must experience. Yet one observation continues appearing with surprising consistency. Across different cultures, belief systems, and spiritual practices, people repeatedly describe similar experiences during this time of year. Individuals who have never studied the Lion's Gate often speak of unexpected coincidences, meaningful synchronicities, unusually vivid dreams, moments of startling clarity, or an unmistakable feeling that life itself is quietly arranging important pieces into place. Whether these experiences arise through psychology, symbolism, spirituality, or some combination beyond present understanding, their recurring nature deserves thoughtful attention rather than immediate dismissal. Many contemporary spiritual teachers, therefore, describe the Lion's Gate as an ideal opportunity to become intentional about the direction of one's life. It is commonly viewed as a favorable moment for releasing habits, beliefs, relationships, or emotional burdens that no longer support genuine personal growth, while simultaneously embracing a more authentic expression of one's true identity. This interpretation harmonizes naturally with the qualities traditionally associated with Leo season, the fixed fire energy surrounding this annual period, encouraging courage, creativity, confidence, and wholehearted self-expression. Once you understand why so many traditions regard this date as uniquely meaningful, another realization naturally follows. Knowing what deserves your attention is only half of the picture. Equally important is recognizing what may interfere with the opportunity this threshold appears to present. If this period truly represents a heightened state of energetic openness, as independent traditions across centuries have repeatedly suggested then your choices, your mindset, and the way you carry yourself through the day become worthy of conscious consideration instead of unconscious habit. It is easy to become fascinated by rituals, affirmations, ceremonies, and intentions believed to strengthen this experience. Yet alongside those practices, an equally enduring stream of wisdom has quietly traveled through generations. Ancient Egyptian perspectives, indigenous teachings, and modern spiritual communities alike have consistently preserved gentle cautions about attitudes and behaviors believed to work against the deeper purpose of a day like this. These cautions were never intended to frighten anyone or convince people that one imperfect decision could permanently damage their spiritual path. Their purpose has always been far more compassionate. They resemble guidance offered by those who have carefully observed life's patterns over many years, noticing what repeatedly nurtured growth and what repeatedly distracted people from recognizing significant moments when they appeared. That accumulated wisdom has gradually formed a collection of practical reminders, encouraging greater awareness during times considered spiritually meaningful. Understanding these 7 commonly repeated cautions allows you to see this tradition as countless people before you have quietly understood it. Long before the phrase "Lion's Gate" became familiar, generations were already approaching this seasonal threshold with both hope and careful respect. When tomorrow arrives and the calendar changes to August 8th, you will not simply be participating in a modern spiritual trend or following ideas introduced through a single community. You will be stepping into a convergence that has been observed, interpreted, and honored for thousands of years. Ancient priests devoted remarkable architectural achievements to recognizing this celestial rhythm. Skilled navigators once depended upon the same heavenly marker while crossing immense oceans. Spiritual seekers throughout today's world continue returning to this date with sincere reverence because they sense themselves participating in something much older than any contemporary movement. Whatever conclusion you personally reach about the deeper nature of this convergence, whether you understand it as a genuine cosmic event or as a meaningful annual invitation for self-reflection, one fact remains especially compelling. Throughout history, cultures separated by geography, language, and belief repeatedly identified this same point in the yearly cycle as worthy of deliberate attention. That extraordinary consistency deserves thoughtful consideration. It reminds us that the significance of this day was not invented to satisfy today's digital culture. Instead, it has quietly traveled across generations, continuing to invite people into a deeper relationship with themselves and with the rhythms they perceive in the universe. Tomorrow offers the opportunity to enter that inheritance with greater awareness, appreciating not only the practices many people choose to embrace, but also the lessons previous generations repeatedly learned about what is wiser to avoid. Before exploring those 7 cautions, however, it is essential to establish the proper perspective. Nothing that follows should leave you feeling fearful about tomorrow, nor should it create the impression that one imperfect choice has the power to erase every step of growth you have already taken. Genuine spiritual traditions rarely describe transformation in such fragile terms. A healthier way to approach these teachings is to imagine receiving advice from someone who has traveled the same road many times before you. Their guidance is not presented as rigid law or inflexible doctrine. Instead, it represents experience distilled into practical wisdom, shared generously so that others may avoid unnecessary struggle and discover greater clarity with less hardship. Although each of these 7 cautions appears different on the surface, they all point toward the same underlying principle. Every one of them describes a way of moving through an important threshold that gradually separates you from its intended purpose instead of bringing you into closer harmony with it. Traditionally, moments such as the Lion's Gate are understood as periods when awareness becomes more receptive, perception grows clearer, and the relationship between inner intention and external experience feels more closely aligned. The attitudes we are about to examine tend to weaken that receptivity, obscure that clarity, or interrupt that alignment. Not because the universe punishes anyone, but because attention naturally shapes experience. Where awareness goes, energy follows. When awareness becomes scattered, meaningful opportunities often pass unnoticed. With that foundation established, we can now begin with the first practice that spiritual traditions have consistently encouraged people to avoid. Surprisingly, it is also the simplest and perhaps the easiest to overlook. The first caution is allowing August 8th to pass exactly like every other ordinary day, rushing from one obligation to another, distracted by endless demands, physically present while mentally somewhere else entirely. Across generations, spiritual teachings have repeatedly emphasized that significant thresholds lose much of their value when approached with complete unconsciousness. This does not require withdrawing from everyday responsibilities or dramatically rearranging your schedule. Few people have the luxury of setting aside an entire day, and authentic traditions have never insisted that such extremes are necessary. Instead, what matters most is cultivating genuine presence within the life you are already living. It may be as simple as sitting quietly with your meal instead of dividing your attention between food and your phone. It may mean noticing the rhythm of your breathing while walking instead of remaining trapped inside endless mental conversations. Even a brief period of undistracted awareness can profoundly influence how this day is experienced and remembered. The wisdom behind this advice becomes surprisingly obvious once you reflect upon it. Thresholds are traditionally described as moments when the distance between ordinary awareness and deeper perception becomes unusually narrow. Yet no matter how open that doorway may become, it cannot truly be recognized if attention remains completely consumed by notifications, schedules, worries, and automatic routines. Opportunities of this kind rarely force themselves into human awareness. They ask only for one simple offering in return: the willingness to notice. If today has already been filled with constant activity, and tomorrow appears equally demanding, perhaps the most meaningful gift you can offer yourself is not a complicated ritual at all, but simply setting aside 5 or 10 uninterrupted minutes of genuine stillness, because that small act of conscious presence may become the doorway through which everything else naturally begins to unfold. Even within the busiest schedule, creating one brief moment of undivided awareness can become more meaningful than filling an entire day with elaborate rituals performed absent-mindedly. Sometimes the most important gift you offer yourself during a threshold is not additional activity, but the willingness to become fully present for a few quiet minutes. From there, another piece of wisdom appears, and for many people it is unexpectedly challenging because it runs against what modern spiritual culture often encourages. The second practice, many traditions consistently advise avoiding, is placing pressure upon yourself to experience something dramatic simply because the calendar suggests you should. One of the greatest misunderstandings surrounding spiritually significant dates is the belief that they must produce an unmistakable breakthrough, an overwhelming emotional release, or an extraordinary supernatural experience. Yet the very act of demanding such an outcome often creates the opposite effect. The more tightly the mind clings to expectations, the less naturally awareness can expand. Instead of openness, expectation produces tension. Instead of quiet receptivity, it creates constant internal evaluation, asking whether enough is happening, whether the experience feels profound enough, whether the universe has somehow overlooked you. That mental pressure can become louder than the subtle insights the day might otherwise reveal. Across many spiritual traditions, meaningful moments connected with periods like this rarely arrive because someone forced them into existence. More often they appear unexpectedly, almost gently, during ordinary situations that seem completely unrelated to spiritual practice. Perhaps a conversation suddenly unfolds in a way that changes your understanding of someone you love. Perhaps while completing a simple daily task, a realization quietly settles into your awareness without fanfare or emotional intensity. These experiences cannot be manufactured through determination alone, and trying to command them frequently leads only to frustration or disappointment. If tomorrow comes and goes without a spectacular revelation, do not interpret that silence as evidence that you missed your opportunity or somehow approached the day incorrectly. Many of life's most meaningful transformations begin invisibly. They unfold beneath conscious awareness before gradually revealing their significance over time. What seems uneventful in the present sometimes becomes recognizable only weeks or months later, when you suddenly realize your perspective has shifted, your priorities have changed, or a decision that once felt impossible now feels completely natural. Allow tomorrow to become whatever it genuinely wishes to become, instead of insisting that it satisfy an image your mind created beforehand. Openness invites possibilities that expectation often unintentionally closes. As we continue, the third caution asks for a different kind of honesty, because it touches a human tendency nearly everyone recognizes. It concerns the temptation to make major, difficult to reverse decisions while emotions are running at their highest intensity, before those emotions have had the opportunity to mature into lasting clarity. Thresholds such as the Lion's Gate are widely described as periods that amplify emotional awareness. Feelings that have quietly accumulated beneath the surface may suddenly become impossible to ignore. Questions that have lingered unresolved for weeks can appear to demand immediate answers. Long-developing insights may arrive with remarkable force, creating the impression that action must happen right now. In many ways, this heightened emotional landscape is exactly what makes such moments spiritually valuable. Strong feelings often illuminate truths that everyday distractions have concealed. Yet emotional intensity alone should never be confused with enduring wisdom. Throughout generations, spiritual traditions have repeatedly distinguished between receiving an authentic insight and immediately acting upon the emotional surge surrounding that insight. The caution is not telling you to distrust what emerges tomorrow. On the contrary, some of the most life-changing realizations genuinely do appear during moments of expanded awareness. The guidance instead concerns timing. When an insight carries consequences that are difficult or impossible to reverse, wisdom encourages allowing the emotional wave to settle before transforming that realization into permanent action. Imagine ending an important relationship during one emotionally charged conversation simply because everything suddenly feels crystal clear. Imagine walking away from your career without allowing yourself time to evaluate whether today's certainty remains equally convincing several days later. Imagine making a major financial commitment solely because a powerful feeling convinced you it must happen immediately. These are the kinds of choices generations of practitioners have gently encouraged people to approach with patience rather than urgency. If tomorrow reveals something important, honor what you discover. Record your thoughts. Reflect deeply upon them. Return to them after the emotional intensity has softened. Authentic truth rarely disappears simply because time has passed. If the realization remains equally strong after several days of quiet reflection, you can move forward with far greater confidence. If, however, its urgency fades or its meaning changes, you will likely appreciate having given yourself the space to respond wisely instead of reacting impulsively. The fourth caution shifts attention towards something surprisingly practical, something that remains largely within your influence even when life feels demanding. It involves consciously limiting unnecessary exposure to people, places, or situations that repeatedly leave you emotionally depleted, mentally overwhelmed, or inwardly diminished. This guidance is not encouraging isolation or suggesting that every uncomfortable interaction should be avoided. Daily life includes responsibilities that cannot simply disappear because a spiritually meaningful date has arrived. No authentic tradition expects complete control over every circumstance. Instead, the wisdom offered here is much more realistic. If tomorrow presents a genuine choice between remaining in an environment that consistently restores your sense of peace or one that repeatedly drains your emotional energy, generations of spiritual teaching suggest choosing restoration whenever that option truly exists. This recommendation becomes especially meaningful because many individuals report feeling more emotionally sensitive during periods such as the Lion's Gate. Experiences that might normally create only mild frustration can suddenly feel unexpectedly exhausting. A noisy, disorganized environment may seem far more overwhelming than it would during an ordinary week. Conversations that usually require little emotional effort may leave you feeling noticeably depleted. If flexibility exists within your schedule, even in small ways, consider protecting a portion of your day with intention. Spend time with people whose presence consistently encourages your growth. Choose quieter surroundings if you have the opportunity. Give yourself permission to leave an unnecessarily draining situation a little earlier than usual if circumstances reasonably allow. Modern astrologers sometimes explain this principle through the language of energetic stewardship. Every person begins each day with a limited reserve of attention, emotional capacity, and mental clarity. A threshold like this often asks you to become more aware than usual, making those inner resources even more valuable. When they are continuously consumed by circumstances that repeatedly diminish your well-being, less remains available for meaningful reflection, deeper awareness, or the subtle insights the day may otherwise reveal. This perspective is not rooted in avoidance or fear. It reflects thoughtful management of your inner resources, approached with the same practical care you would naturally apply before any genuinely important event. Looking back across these first four cautions, an unmistakable pattern gradually becomes visible. Allowing the day to disappear into distraction, demanding extraordinary experiences from it, making irreversible decisions during emotional intensity, and unnecessarily remaining within environments that repeatedly drain your spirit all point toward the same underlying challenge. Each one weakens the quality of presence that spiritual traditions have associated with significant thresholds for centuries. None of these teachings ask for perfection. They do not require you to spend tomorrow existing in a flawless state of uninterrupted mindfulness. Your responsibilities will still exist. Daily routines will continue. Ordinary life does not pause simply because an important date arrives. What truly matters is cultivating enough awareness to recognize these patterns. If they begin appearing throughout your day, then gently choosing a different response whenever you honestly have the freedom to do so. 4 pieces of wisdom now stand before us, yet 3 more remain. Together, they reveal a much richer understanding than any single caution could ever provide by itself. As today gradually reaches its conclusion, and the Lion's Gate draws ever closer, take a quiet moment to reflect upon everything we've explored together. Across thousands of years, countless individuals have arrived at this very point on the calendar, carrying forward observations refined through repeated experience and careful attention. You now understand the first 4 practices those generations consistently encouraged people to avoid. Carry that understanding into tomorrow, not as inflexible law, but as thoughtful guidance offered by those who crossed this same threshold long before your own journey brought you here. Now we arrive at the 5th caution, one that has become increasingly relevant in our modern world, where spiritual experiences are constantly shared, displayed, and discussed online. The next practice many traditions encourage avoiding is measuring your own experience of this day against the stories, emotions, revelations, or apparent breakthroughs you see other people describing. Whether those comparisons happen through conversations, social media, or spiritual communities. One truth quietly connects every tradition we have explored together, whether we are looking back to the sacred practices of ancient Egyptian priests or listening to the perspectives of contemporary spiritual teachers. None of these traditions ever suggested that every person should encounter a meaningful threshold in exactly the same way. On the contrary, They consistently recognized that every individual arrives carrying a unique history, a unique emotional landscape, and a unique rhythm of personal growth. Because of that, they understood from the very beginning that a shared cosmic moment would naturally produce deeply personal experiences rather than identical ones. That understanding becomes especially important today because we live in an age where people immediately share their spiritual experiences with the world. Tomorrow, countless stories will appear, describing extraordinary dreams, overwhelming emotional breakthroughs, unmistakable synchronicities, and life-changing realizations. Reading those accounts can quietly create the illusion that your own experience should resemble theirs. If your day feels calmer, quieter, or less dramatic, it becomes surprisingly easy to wonder whether you somehow missed the opportunity or failed to connect with the deeper purpose of the Lion's Gate. Yet this kind of comparison has never been encouraged within the traditions that have honored this threshold across generations. It almost always pulls attention away from your own authentic experience and redirects it toward someone else's interpretation of theirs. A peaceful day is not a lesser day. A subtle realization is not less meaningful than an emotional breakthrough. A quiet sense of inner stability deserves just as much respect as an experience filled with obvious external signs. History offers no evidence that profound transformation must always arrive accompanied by dramatic emotion or unmistakable symbolism. Often, the deepest changes happen almost silently, revealing themselves only after time has allowed their roots to grow. The visible intensity of another person's story tells you absolutely nothing about the depth of what may be quietly unfolding within your own life. If tomorrow moves gently, trust that gentle movement completely. Your spiritual journey has never required outside approval in order to be authentic. The moment you begin measuring your internal reality against another person's outward description, your own perception gradually becomes distorted instead of clarified. A simple practice recommended across many modern spiritual traditions can help preserve that authenticity. Before reading what anyone else has shared about their experience, spend a few quiet moments recording your own. Write 2 or 3 honest sentences describing how the day genuinely felt to you before allowing outside voices to shape your perspective. That small act creates an anchor, allowing your own truth to settle first. Once your experience has been acknowledged, it becomes far less likely that someone else's more dramatic story will quietly replace or diminish the quieter experience that was genuinely yours. From there, we arrive at the 6th caution, one that may seem unexpectedly practical after so much discussion about spirituality, yet its importance has remained remarkably consistent across generations. The next practice to avoid is dismissing the genuine messages your physical body communicates, simply because you are searching for exclusively spiritual explanations. During periods many people regard as energetically significant, individuals frequently report unusual physical sensations. Some describe increased fatigue. Others notice heightened emotional sensitivity, shifts in mood, changes in sleep patterns, or simply the feeling that something within them is different from an ordinary day. Many spiritual traditions acknowledge that these experiences may naturally accompany periods of increased awareness. At the same time, those very same traditions repeatedly emphasize something equally important. Spiritual understanding should never replace practical wisdom. Instead, the two should support one another. Throughout history, authentic spiritual practice has encouraged balance rather than extremes. If tomorrow your body sincerely asks for rest, allow yourself to rest instead of forcing unnecessary activity because you believe a spiritually significant date demands constant productivity or heightened awareness. If you experience symptoms that genuinely concern you from a physical standpoint, respond responsibly and seek appropriate medical care rather than assuming every discomfort must contain a hidden mystical message waiting to be decoded. This approach does not weaken your spiritual practice. It strengthens it by honoring the wholeness of your existence. None of the traditions we have explored ever presented physical well-being as somehow separate from spiritual well-being. Instead, they understood the body and the inner life as partners moving together through the same journey. Caring for one has always supported caring for the other. As tomorrow unfolds, listen carefully to both. Pay attention to your intuition, your emotions, and your spiritual awareness, but also honor the clear wisdom communicated through your body. Neither deserves to be ignored, and neither should automatically be elevated above the other. Maintaining that balance is itself an expression of mature spiritual understanding. Finally, we arrive at the seventh and last caution, a reminder that quietly brings this entire exploration back to the place where it first began. The final practice many traditions encourage avoiding is allowing August 8th to pass exactly like any other day without offering even the smallest conscious acknowledgement of its meaning. If this date has become significant for you, honoring it does not require elaborate ceremonies, complex rituals, or hours of meditation. Nothing within the traditions we have discussed suggests that only grand gestures can properly recognize this threshold. What truly matters is something far simpler and, perhaps because of its simplicity, far more powerful. There is a meaningful difference between allowing a day to disappear unnoticed into ordinary routine and intentionally pausing, even briefly, to recognize that this particular moment holds personal significance. That acknowledgement may last only a few quiet breaths. It may be a single sentence written in a journal, describing what you are choosing to release or what you hope to welcome into the next chapter of your life. It may be a moment of silent gratitude before the day begins, or a few peaceful minutes spent reflecting beneath the morning sky. The action itself is less important than the awareness behind it. Looking across every tradition we have explored today, an unmistakable thread continues appearing again and again. Ancient Egyptian priests aligned sacred temples with the annual return of Sirius. Indigenous navigators observed the same brilliant star while crossing immense stretches of open ocean. Modern spiritual communities gather each year in quiet reflection as this date returns. Although their practices differ, one principle remains remarkably consistent. Conscious acknowledgement transforms an ordinary moment into a meaningful one. The astronomical event will unfold whether or not anyone notices it. The stars continue moving according to their own timeless rhythms. Yet the deeper value generations have discovered within this convergence has always depended upon a deliberate human choice. The simple willingness to pause, become present, and recognize that something worthy of attention is unfolding. That single act of awareness, however brief it may be, has connected countless people across thousands of years, reminding them that some of life's most meaningful thresholds are not defined by how loudly they announce themselves, but by whether we choose to notice them when they quietly arrive. If tomorrow offers you nothing else, allow yourself at least one brief moment of uninterrupted stillness to recognize the meaning this day holds in your own life. That meaning does not have to resemble anyone else's, nor does it need to follow a prescribed ritual. It simply needs to be genuine. In many ways, this final piece of guidance appears almost effortless compared to everything else we have explored. Yet beneath its simplicity lies the deepest connection to the reason this annual convergence has continued surviving across thousands of years of human history. Although every tradition we have discussed explains this moment through its own language and worldview, they ultimately arrive at the same quiet understanding. Meaning does not automatically exist within a date simply because it appears on the calendar. Meaning emerges when human beings consciously choose to recognize it. When people intentionally pause, direct their awareness toward a particular moment, and decide that it deserves their attention, something ordinary begins transforming into something personally significant. Without that conscious participation, Even the most extraordinary celestial alignment remains nothing more than another complete rotation of the Earth around its familiar path. With that participation, however, an ordinary square on a calendar becomes a moment that countless generations have regarded with reverence. As we reflect on the 7 cautions we have explored together, a remarkably consistent pattern reveals itself, moving carelessly through the day without presence, pressuring yourself to manufacture an extraordinary spiritual experience, allowing powerful emotions to dictate irreversible decisions before wisdom has time to mature, remaining unnecessarily within environments that continually drain your emotional strength, measuring your own journey against the visible experiences of others, ignoring the legitimate needs of your physical body while searching only for spiritual explanations. Finally, allowing the entire day to disappear unnoticed without even the smallest act of conscious acknowledgement. At first glance, these may appear to be separate pieces of advice, yet together they express one unified philosophy, a body of wisdom refined patiently across centuries through careful observation of how human beings respond to meaningful thresholds. None of these reminders ask you to become perfect. None require flawless mindfulness or ideal spiritual discipline. Instead, each one gently points toward the same destination, greater awareness. That is the quality ancient Egyptian priests cultivated while observing the return of Sirius. It is the same attentiveness indigenous navigators demonstrated while following the stars across immense oceans. It is the same quiet intention modern spiritual practitioners continue seeking today as this annual convergence approaches. Perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of this entire story is that civilizations separated by vast distances, different languages, and completely independent histories repeatedly discovered strikingly similar principles for approaching moments like this. That shared understanding suggests something worth considering. Perhaps the true nature of meaningful thresholds has always been less about extraordinary external events and more about the way human awareness naturally responds when invited into deeper presence. Tomorrow, you carry this complete perspective with you, not as a collection of rigid obligations, but as inherited wisdom generously passed forward by generations who encountered this same threshold long before your own lifetime. As our time together comes to a close, it feels fitting to return to the question that first opened this entire exploration. Why does August 8th continue drawing the attention of millions of people year after year, despite differences in culture, geography, religion, and personal belief? The answer may ultimately be far simpler than many expect. Throughout history, humanity has always been drawn toward moments that seem to exist just beyond the rhythm of ordinary time. We naturally recognize occasions that invite us to slow down, reflect, and consciously step into something that feels larger than everyday routine. Whether that invitation comes through the ancient return of Sirius, the symbolic significance many people associate with the number 88, or the collective attention modern spiritual communities have chosen to give this date, August 8th has gradually become one of those rare moments where countless individual journeys quietly intersect. It has become a shared point of reflection that transcends any single explanation. That may be the deepest reason this day continues holding such enduring significance. Its importance does not depend upon proving one particular spiritual theory correct or convincing everyone to interpret it through exactly the same lens. Instead, its lasting power comes from the simple fact that generation after generation has willingly offered this moment sincere attention. Across thousands of years, people have continued deciding that this point in the calendar deserves to be experienced consciously rather than overlooked. By choosing that same awareness for yourself tomorrow, you become part of something extending far beyond any individual tradition, teacher, or single conversation. You participate in a continuous human story that has quietly unfolded across civilizations, connecting people who may never have shared the same language, yet somehow recognized the same invitation. Perhaps that is the clearest way to understand why this annual threshold has never truly disappeared. It asks remarkably little from anyone. It does not require unquestioning belief, complete certainty, or perfect understanding. Instead, it extends one simple invitation, offering you the opportunity to slow down and become fully attentive in a world that rarely encourages such stillness. Tomorrow, exactly as countless people before you have done throughout history, you will have the freedom to decide how you wish to answer that invitation. Before we part, I would genuinely love to hear how this reflection has spoken to you. Share in the comments which of these 7 cautions resonated most deeply with your own life, or tell us what intention you plan to carry with you as you move through August 8th. Every reflection contributes to something larger than any one person's experience. Together they create a space where people from different places, different backgrounds, and different walks of life prepare for the same meaningful threshold while encouraging one another with honesty and respect. If today's exploration brought you greater clarity or helped you see tomorrow from a new perspective, consider supporting this community by liking the video, subscribing as we continue exploring the remarkable celestial events unfolding throughout the rest of this cosmic year, and sharing this conversation with someone who may appreciate understanding not only the practices often associated with the Lion's Gate, but also the wisdom generations have consistently preserved about what is wiser to avoid. Whatever tomorrow ultimately brings into your life, welcome it with quiet awareness, steady presence, and an open heart. More than any ritual, any interpretation, or any expectation, that attentive presence has remained the one constant thread connecting every tradition we have explored today. For thousands of years, that simple willingness to notice has been enough. Thank you for choosing to spend this time with me, and for approaching tomorrow with curiosity, thoughtfulness, and genuine respect, instead of simply seeking quick answers. Until we meet again, I will see you at the gate,